Hello, everyone. Um, I'm trying this out again. I want to sort of give a new kind of overview since I'm getting a lot of new people coming to my work via Instagram and some of these sort of pithy memes that I'm sharing. And so I'm wrestling with how to both use technology and interact with social media and the audience that seems to want the information that I have, or is at least curious and about the information that I have. Uh, and I'm using some new technology with the subtitles so that I have to edit more, and it just takes more of my limited energy. But all that being said, this is going to be like a mini class lecture. And the reason I say lecture is because it's based in view teachings, overview, view teachings, worldview teachings, and less about method. And the reason that I have to say that first is because everyone thinks that methods are sort of like one size fits all, and there are general methods that could be one size fits all, but to really give someone methods to use, I think is disingenuous when I'm not in relation with them or contacting their nervous system whatsoever. And so that's also how I pay my bills, very barely pay my bills, is that I sort of rely on donations and I rely on people taking the chance to actually learn and apprentice to these methods in a way that is actually not a short term quick fix, but is a real training. So let me talk a bit about the training. So I am trained as a physical theater maker and a clown on one level, worked with children, worked in the service industry for a long time, in the sort of this kind of nightclub industry. But the other thing I'm trained in is a sort of Taoist methodology, a Taoist cosmology from my dead teacher Lu Ming. I'm also trained in other sort of mystical ritual matters. But I'm going to focus on Lu Ming for a bit here because Lu Ming was maybe the teacher that gave me the greatest insight into how to frame teaching and critical thinking in a decolonial framework. Even though I don't think Ming ever said the word decolonial, that's what I learned through absorbing his teachings and then applying it to my own ancestors and my own heritage and my own critical thought process. And that took very many years, and I'm still in that process. And I wouldn't say that I'm an expert in any of Ming's subjects. I'm still learning from his recordings that he left after he died. But the way that he taught was very interesting, and the way that he left his teachings was also interesting in the sense that he taught live sessions to live students. A lot of his students were Chinese medicine practitioners. And Lu Ming is quite a divisive figure in the kind of Chinese medicine and Taoist world, and I'm also quite a divisive figure. And I think that that's necessary because divisive figures tend to see things from an angle that the common status quo or social norm does not. They can't see sort of past their own biases, and sort of people that are on the outside can see things a little differently and a little maybe more clearly. And so what he did is he would record all of his lectures, so hundreds, maybe thousands of hours of lectures, sort of classified by topic, these classes that he taught. And so I'm attempting to do that via social media in a different kind of way, but similarly to an oral tradition. I'm not going to be putting up a whole bunch of visual maps for you. I'm not going to be sort of giving you a whole lot of shortcuts for your dopamine system to sort of think that it's gotten an insight. I'm really trying to connect on an oral tradition level as a real person, unedited, right? So I'm not doing any of those fast cuts. I'm not shortening the time it takes for me to actually think through how I want to talk about something. I'm not reading from a teleprompter. I'm talking just as I would talk to a room full of people, just from my own system, trying to delineate a kind of exploration of topics that I have spent many, many years practicing in my own nervous system, with my own conditions, my own struggles, and my own needs. So that's the way that I'm teaching. And that's, I think, a very important way to teach that we have lost in this digital media age. And so that's like a beginning of the talk, is just I want to prepare you for how I'm talking. I want to prepare you for this idea that you want it in a quick bite, right? You want everything sort of, fast. And I think that's a problem in our society. We don't learn fast. We learn slow. That's how our nervous system learns. It's slow before fast. Any athletic trainer will tell you this, that the nervous system, if you want to go fast, go slow. Learn the technique. Learn how to pay attention with your nervous system. Learn how to attend to your own anxieties in the moment, taking a break when you need to. So with that being said, let's begin this lecture. So first I want you to take a mindful yawn with me 3 times. We're going to do mindful yawning and stretching, and that just means you really pay attention to how the yawn begins, how it crests, and how it ends, and that fallow, peaceful place after. And we're going to do that 3 times together. So on your own time, and then I'll just rock on. All right. So I suggest that anytime you start to think too much, roll around in your head too much, start to feel anxious, start to feel tight, you pause the video and you do 3 mindful yawns and stretches. And that means slow stretching, mindful yawning, putting your attention on the movement slowly, not dissociating from it, and actually being with the rise and the fall of the movements, of the energy, of the intensity. That's sort of the one generalized method I'll probably give everyone, just because that's sort of like mammal physiology 101. So anyway, what are we going to talk about today? So I've been writing some memes on the Instagram and the Facebook, trying to just sort of be a little punchy, a little pokey, because that's how I work. I'm a satirist on some level, but I'm also sort of like a indigenous scientist, in that the nervous system and the research that the nervous system can do, the ceremonial research that the nervous system can undertake, is a very important part of the scientific method. And people are finally starting to realize that indigenous knowledge and the Western scientific method are actually need to be braided together. And we need to return to right relations. And how I've learned right relations is through a mixture of Tibetan, Buddhist, and Taoist practices, as well as various, South American and Native American indigenous practices. Um, I am not formally a lineage keeper of any sort. I'm a mixed race Puerto Rican American. I'm kind of abandoned. I'm kind of exiled. I'm kind of an outcast. I was born in 1979. Mixed race people were still kind of a weird new thing. Um, and I was bred to be a white person, essentially, socioculturally. And that really, this kind of trauma that this indoctrination or this assimilation process that I was put under since birth is a large part of how I see the decolonization process within a human being, within a body. And then that body is sort of fractaled out over a group or society. And so a lot of what we're dealing with here is the unlearning of colonial frameworks for perception. And so when I talk about emotions and how many people are processing their emotions in a colonial way, I'm looking at it from both an addiction detox standpoint, but also from detoxing from addiction to codependency, narcissistic tendencies, and enmeshment. And all of that is a decolonial process. All of this, what I'm talking about, not just substance abuse, but behavioral substance abuse, that we are addicted to emotional, behavioral, cognitive, behavioral loops, right? These kind of action loops, these feedback loops that we are constantly running in order to sort of make sense of reality, to perceive reality in a way that we feel safe enough. And I do a lot of these quotes because all of these words are loaded with colonial booby traps. They are loaded with a kind of dualistic, binary, individualistic, Catholic Protestant worldview. That's where all of these words have these tags on them that are extremely harmful to practice. And so what we have to do is we have to very carefully examine how we have been assimilated, indoctrinated, colonized by these ideas of control, of domination by the elite ruling class. This kind of propaganda mechanism that we've all been put through with schooling and everything, politics and everything like that, and even our food system, our economic system. These are all ways that they indoctrinate us into behaving in ways we don't even understand we're behaving in. We don't even understand that our behaviors are colonial. We just think, oh, this is my personality. And we have to really reckon with, we may not know what our real personality is because it's so environmentally driven. And the environment we're in is a colonial environment. So you have to come to that really maybe terrifying. It's maybe terrifying for you at the beginning, but then it becomes extremely life-giving. And for a lot of people who meet my work, they never get past the terrifying stage because their system, their nervous system is designed to protect them from any perceived threat. But you have to understand that in an indigenous worldview, not all perceived threat is technically threatening. It's just an initiation towards wisdom. So if you can't understand that some of your threat is steering you away from initiation towards wisdom, you'll never go towards it. So you have to get through that sort of barrier to entry, which is your own nervous system sort of giving you a threat response and telling you something is too scary, a fear response or a pain response. And the pain and the fear response are very linked. And a lot of our pain is just psychosomatic. It's our nervous system telling us, don't go there. And we're going to stop you by creating a pain signal or a disease signal or some kind of other negative symptom in your system so that you stop going towards the threat. But the threat here is nebulous because the threat is all around us because we've all been colonized. So our threat response system is extremely confused. And the decolonization process that I've gone through, that I'm still going through, that I'm trying to help other people go through, is one of fundamentally re-relating to how our multiple spirits in our body perceive each other, perceive other spirits. And so I'll talk about this a lot, but you can consider that your brain has 5 networks, network neuroscience, but also in Taoist or Tibetan cosmology, we talk about the 5 elements or the 5 spirits or the 5 Shen, and those are related to the 5 organs, the 5 major organ systems. I'm not going to go into that a lot, but just recognize that at a very base level, many older scientific indigenous cultures have determined that we are made up of no less than 5 spirits. Our corporeal body is the combination, the synthetic combination of these overlapping spiritual entities coming together for a brief period of time called a human life. And that would be our so-called personality. And any disruption in those spirits, any stagnant chi, any disease pathologies, any colonization, any wrong relationships is going to emerge as a kind of negative symptom in the personality, in the psychology, in the spirituality, whatever you want to say, but any way that we relate. And all these words are just words for perception and relation. How I think, how I feel, how I sense, all of those are just tags for perception and relationship together, because how we perceive and how we relate are super entwined. They're interdependent. So that's a sort of overview. Okay. And it's one way that I talk about the overview. When we're doing decolonization process, we need the mind to start working with us and not against us. And that takes a long time because people are very addicted to their belief systems and their identity system, their identity matrix. And we have to sort of decolonize all that crap because it's stopping us from critical analysis and critical perception. And if you can't work with the diversity of your system and the diversity of other systems in the field, other beings, other bodies, on fractal, micro, and macro levels, if you can't do that in a very good way, if you don't have a system, if you don't have a process that is enjoyable for you to actually grok what's going on, then you're going to run into states of fight or flight, dissociation, fawning, freeze, whatever you want to call it. You're going to get into some inaccurate fantasy model of reality where you start believing that the fantasy that you're perceiving is reality. And decolonization is, in my estimation, the process of slowly, gradually de-scarring the system so that we can actually have our experience but not necessarily believe it as a truth, as 100% absolute truth, but just work with the way our system is perceiving and absorbing information and energy, and then make really careful animist decisions and behavioral choices and options, actions that are fun, playful, you might even say healing or sacred or ceremonial or whatever you want to say. These words are just words I'm giving you to sort of help you understand how a person can get out of their dissociative or hypersympathetic complexes and get to something that is holistic, grounded, centered, dynamic, playful, engaged, but also cautious and skeptical, so that one doesn't rush into toxic, addicting scenarios and deal with the backlash of doing that. The years and years of backlash that you have to consider when you realize that people are coded or assimilated or indoctrinated into codependent and meshed colonial ways of relating with each other and the natural world and their own bodies. And when we are that far down the line of indoctrination and addiction, it's going to feel worse before it feels better. A very basic idea, just talking it from a Western nervous system perspective, is that If you're all the way in dissociation, first you have to get back to depression. And then from depression, you have to get back to anxiety. And from anxiety, then eventually you can get back to a kind of baseline state. But to the dissociated person, way over here in like blankness land or numbness, you can't even feel things correctly. Everything feels nebulous. Going from that to depression or melancholy, despair, nihilism, where you actually are feeling again, without a truly decolonial framework around that, you won't make that leap. Unless you're really stubborn and determined and you're just sick and tired of where you're at, you won't go there because it feels safer to stay in blankness or dissociation. And so the method that I teach people is how we could create conditions and scaffolds and structures and processes and artistic, creative processes around moving our system, all of it, all of the various strands of our system that might be everywhere in the universe because we've been shattered by some kind of event or some kind of long-term chronic fatigue or something. We're going to bring the soul back to the body and then take everybody, every spirit along for the ride and say, we're all going back home together. And home is not some other place. Home is this locus of perception and relation, this constantly flowing center where the mind, the body, and the spirit are all working together with all of their many kind of parliamentary constituents to actually come back together and work as a complementary team back towards wholeness. Okay, so that's the overall system. And you have to believe that it's possible on some level, or at least you are interested and curious about it being possible for you in your particular situation. If ghostly voices come into your head or into your body and start raging up all of these emotions and thoughts, that's the first step, really, to actually understanding what's going on. And you sort of look at those things in a clear and careful way, and you move forward, taking everybody on board. Again, the methods for this are much longer than I can do in one video, and I wouldn't want to just blanket people with methods because each person, when they sit in front of me, there is a spiritual, soulful connection happening where the right information starts to come through for that person. I'm not talking to an individual right now, so I can't do that. I can only sort of give overviews and containers for an entire process, smaller versions of that process, these fractal rhizomes, right? And I can talk from my perspective and my experience, but I can't sort of guarantee that your experience is going to be exactly the same or is going to be easy and simple. But what I can try to do in the overviews are try to simplify Gestalt so that your brain starts to understand a way of working with the world that actually has agency, but is not dominating agency, but it has agency, which is the ability to say no, right? That's the first step for a lot of people, is really the ability to say no. And to say no, not just to other people, but to say no within your own system. And to have those spirits actually listen so that you can actually go, no, we're going to work with this in a different way. I'm not interested in having some kind of panic attack right now. We are going to work together, right? That's the no I'm talking about. It's a coalition building no, which is what you have to get under your skin. You have to be a coalition builder within the system of the entire body, including dealing with any pathogens that you might have to see a doctor about, which is like my own process, is that I see Tibetan Chinese doctors because I have pathogens in my system since birth that never were correctly diagnosed. And they have affected my trajectory, my neurological maturation, my development of my nervous system. They've affected everything, my endocrine system. And on a spiritual level, that is wisdom trying to teach me something about resolving my fate in this lifetime. So as hard as it is to live like this in an ableist capitalist society, from the spiritual animist perspective, everything is wisdom, including the negative symptoms. So first, we have to understand this this understanding that everything is wisdom. And then we break it down to yin and yang and the 5 elements and all this other fight and flight and freeze and the sympathetic nervous system and all these subdivisions, right? But at its holistic baseline, the entire universe is sort of wisdom play. Play as in theater play, but play as in children playing, right? It's the same play. It's the play of the universe, this kind of wisdom. And play is not always not painful or not scary. We have to understand that fear, pain, and hunger or desire are also wisdom forces that we should actually work with and not against, okay? And that's sort of like a very short overview of what I would call my death practice, which I've made 8 modules about the history and the pedagogy of that, which are on my Substack website that people can buy in 4 hours of lecture times 8 modules, right? Lectures and practices. And I'm sort of still building on that with these other talks that I'm doing. But if people want like just a death practice kind of download, that's what I made those modules for last year. Okay, so all of that being said, what is it about my posts about emotion that get people so riled up? Well, you have to first understand that an addicted mind is an extremist mind. And so addiction, colonization, assimilation, narcissism, enmeshment, codependency, all of this are like the same cluster of symptoms, right? So if someone has been extremely dissociated, then that would mean that they view people who are extremely undissociated as extreme and vice versa. And when a lot of people think about what a healed person is, it is a person who sort of feels everything intensely. And that's wrong. That's very wrong. So extremism, any form of hyper extreme anything, is always a signal that something is a little fucking out of whack. It doesn't mean you can't feel things during a process very intensely. It just means you have to be suspicious about your system becoming addicted to that intensity, whether addicted because it wants it more or addicted to running away from it. So all of this extreme approach and extreme avoid, we have to start to soften the blow because this is too much for the nervous system to deal with. Another way to think about trauma is it's anything that's too intense for the nervous system. And it needs to manage that intensity by developing some kind of defensive or coping mechanism. And when it does that, then we start to develop all these maladaptations because we're always avoiding things or we're always running to things and we're craving them. And it's like all mess. So with emotions, if you're very dissociated, you need to get more associated. But then there are people that are too associated. And then there are people that are somewhat super dissociated from some aspects of their life and some feelings that they're feeling, and they're too hyper associated with other things that they're feeling. And this is the complexity of what we're dealing with. Things where you're hyper associated or you're hyper dissociated, right? And in some way that's a sort of, oxymoron, or not an oxymoron, but when it's just redundant, hyper dissociated. Dissociation is already a hyper response. But most people don't think about hyper associated. But when you look around, you see there's tons of people who are hyper associated with feelings. Certain feelings they're hyper associated with. And that's bad. That's actually a form of addiction that we need to be able to take a step back from and go, why the fuck can't I, that, because that's not actually peaceful. It might give you a great rush of endorphins, but we have to be very careful about how we are producing our endogenous opioids and endorphins and various chemicals inside the system. And this isn't to blunt anything, but some things, when they're too sharp, deserve to be blunted. Why is this? Because the system thrives when it has options. This is the point. You need to develop a nervous system that, through whatever experiences it's having, knows that it has multiple options available at every point in that journey. Multiple, not just one or two, multiple. Variations on positioning, behavior, stance, right? We need variations. If we don't have variations, we're very brittle and we're very fragile. And you can look at this through a sort of athletic lens where we know that the older a lot of people get and they don't practice getting up and getting down from the floor without assistance, and we don't practice walking on uneven surfaces anymore, that when they fall, when they're older and they haven't practiced, something breaks, maybe even causes them to die with internal bleeding. Now, a robust system has multiple variations along any point in that journey, which is to say, any point in the locomotive process, we would have hundreds of micro options available all the way through the chain of the body. Now, this alone will teach you a lot about the nervous system. If you just walk slowly and go off center and back to center and head over foot and really develop your ability to change position in space and time using whatever locomotive capacity you have. Moving backwards, forwards, eyes up, eyes down, eyes closed, eyes open, head positioning, torso positioning, hip, pelvis positioning. If you just understand this basic principle and then break it out into what I'm talking about with emotions, because perception starts with the motor control loop, which is mechanosensory loop. Okay? So you have mechanoreceptors in your joints and skin and muscles, and they are determining how your body senses where it is in space and time. And as we do this, those sensations develop into larger clusters of emotional qualia, unease, anxiety, fear, joy, arousal, whatever you want to call it. They develop from this basic mechanoreceptive state, okay? And so, because as a culture we are so anti the body, we have now placed the locus of our attention on either mental or emotional, phenomenon. And what we have to understand is that they're building blocks more than they are separate. That from our sensations, literal sensations that don't have any real narrative, we build an emotional narrative, and then we build a metacognitive narrative, which includes our identity narratives and our belief narratives and all these thoughts that we think about the abstraction of things, right? And what we're trying to do is get everybody back to the same page of what's the building blocks, what's happening here. And first we go to sensations, and we learn to differentiate sensations, and we learn to move sensations through circulation, through exercise, through various kind of somatic practices. And none of this is about releasing trauma from the body, because that's a fucking myth. It may appear that you're releasing trauma from the body, but that's an appearance. That's not reality. And we have to understand that a lot of what we've believed to be true about trauma is a colonial narrative that nobody bothered to fucking break down. And it traps people in these loops that are very bad, these mythological loops that fuck us all up as a culture. So first we deal with sensations, and we deal with our preferences to certain sensations and not others. And we deal with that on a sensory level. Then we take all that learning, that experiential knowledge, and we apply that to the emotions. And we start to look at emotions through a very simple lens, which is, 1, in 2 seconds, can I name what I think this emotion is? Remember, that's just step 1. So let's say I'm feeling anger. Okay. In 2 seconds, can I name it? Yes, I'm angry, I'm frustrated, I'm rageful. Great, done. Great. Now, go deeper. Where is it located primarily? Well, and then you describe it a little bit. Maybe you touch it. Yeah, it feels like it's over here. It's radiating. Great. Okay, you've located it. Take a breath. Maybe do a mindful yawn. See if that changes anything. It doesn't have to change anything, but often just from this perspective, you can start to move, circulate energy. Okay, so I feel it there. I'm going to do a mindful yawn and stretch. Okay, interesting. Great. Step 3. We can start to branch off here, but just a very simple methodology that you can use. Can you describe what this thing that you've called anger looks like? Oh, I can't do that. I can't see. Okay, great. Here's some techniques. Imagine that it was something far away on the horizon. What does it look like? Or imagine this was an abstract painting you saw at the museum. What does it look like? Imagine this is something in nature, like a phenomenon in nature. What is it? Imagine it's a sound or a piece of music. What does it sound like? What does it feel like? What is its texture? Right? All of these are ways that the system can begin to slightly externalize and differentiate so that it can start to become curious about what the fuck is actually happening. It's dreaming while you're awake, on purpose. Okay, it's the first step. From that place of really, what does it look like, sound like, feel like? What does it look like at a distance? What does it look like, right? You start to kind of see it like a children's storybook, maybe. You start to look at it in different angles, perceive it with all of your senses. You've located it somewhere in the body so you can place your attention on it, right? From this point of view, what I would say to most people, and this is my methodology, right, that I've come up with over years, which is set a timer for 5 minutes. You must set a timer and it must go off and you must hear it. Set a timer for 5 minutes and write a poem. It doesn't have to make sense to anyone. It can be gobbledygook, it can be pictures, it can be whatever. The point is, now take 5 minutes and write a poem about this phenomenon that you have titled anger. That's fine. Okay? That 5 minutes is going to change your fucking life. But you won't be able to predict it, and this is precisely the decolonization process. You cannot predict, because prediction is tied into our colonization. Constantly predicting what we think is real and not going into the unknown because super afraid of the unknown. So we want to predict. What we need to get to is non-predictive relationship. Okay? So as you do that with your phenomenon, what I then tell people to do is go walk around, do some mindful yawning and breathing. Don't look at the paper anymore. Then I ask them to come back. I say, now you're going to write one more line of that poetry, only one more, as few words as possible. And I'm going to give you 1 minute to do it. But you have to do it with this prompt, which is, what is the real name of this phenomenon? What is the real name of this spirit? You thought it was anger. You went through that whole process. And then you wrote this poem and you don't know what the fuck is going on now. And now I say 1 minute, write the real name of this phenomenon. And remember, you've just primed your brain with poetry, so something very special and unique to you is going to come out of that. And after that, we take a break, we say thank you to the spirits, and that's a sort of fractal of dealing with what we could consider a negative symptom in the body. Okay? And that is one piece of this thread that we have to deal with in the decolonization process, but it's something I give to people at the beginning of the work, because they have to understand how they can artistically, creatively, with a lot of interest and a lot of exploration, deal with a so-called negative symptom, what we would consider a negative emotion. Negative emotions. It's so funny. What we would consider that, and we need to decolonize it right now, immediately, without needing to go to a therapist. Now, if you do this work with a trained person, you can get even deeper. But I'm also interested in people being able to just fucking do the work, right? But if you work with me, then we will take that seed and do other things over time, because you'll first learn the technique, and then you will apply the technique in your life. And then you will return and we will have reflective processes by which you could further decolonize your relationship to whatever symptoms that is, so that we could get to what's really causing that symptom. Or, at the very least, we could stop being so angry about having the symptom. That's one way that we start to decolonize emotions. So, if you do the research, you will understand that most emotions are culturally encoded. The same emotions don't show up the same ways in different cultures, so we have to understand then that emotions itself are kind of a construct. They're a construct based on how we think we're supposed to behave in a society, or how our system has maladapted to defend itself in a certain environment. And once we get there, we have a lot of work to do, because we have to start to slowly stop reifying the colonial narrative around our emotions for a very long time, until we can stop just doing this weird little defense-offense dance with them and start to come into real relationship with the actual energetic patterns that are arising, right? I'm going to wrap it up here in a minute, because it's already been a long talk, and I want people to just understand the gravity of just doing this. But recognizing that when we start to work with emotions in this way, from sensation upwards, instead of just believing this narrative about the emotion, we actually work with the sensation of the emotion, and then we stop believing the emotion. We actually just discover it, but we stop believing it, we stop obeying it. We start going, hey, what's going on? I don't really like this feeling. I'm going to explore it, but I'm really asking you to calm down. I'm really saying no, right? We start to actually develop real agency. This takes time, but it's totally possible to do this. From there, we can begin to do other more advanced spiritual or cognitive decolonization processes, right? Artistic, creative, decolonial processes around the phenomenon that we don't like. But even better than that, so this is also the negativity bias, is we want to fix all the things we don't like. And I give people some tools for that at the beginning, because they need to develop agency with what they don't like. But the real juice is in discovering what you can't even see right now. Because our perception is not just shaped by what we don't like. It's shaped by the absence of what we can't perceive. And this is where it gets really non-dual and really kind of strange, and really how we have to ground all of our fantasy delusions into the body and actually begin to be here now while also dreaming now, but also not believing our dreams totally and 100%, but actually just using them as a kind of oracular, data set, right? This is where it goes eventually, but for most people, that is too intense to process. And so we have to baby step the system into being extremely grounded and stable so that when we go into sort of more advanced work that is more intense and destabilizing on purpose, then there is a stable base to return to, an oscillation that can happen between extreme stability and agency and moments of destabilization and wonder and awe and delusion and fantasy, and return to stability without making hyper meaningful narratives around the visions or phenomena that we experienced when we destabilized. So that last part is what most people will dissociate from, which is do not develop a new fucking marketing scheme to tell people that they can transcend based on these momentary destabilized delusions that you have had or will have or other people will have. Do not fucking read into it until you are stable enough. And that part is the part nobody's really doing online. Because we all want to interpret our dreams. And unless you have a really strong, stable base of what that even means, what does interpret even mean, what does perception even mean, then you're going to interpret things based on your already pre-existing addictions. That's it, because that's your baseline. What you're stable in now is a delusional addiction, codependent, enmeshed, narcissistic, whatever, colonial, whatever. That's what your homeostatic stability is. So how do you expect to generate meaning that isn't based on that yet? That's the sticky wicket. That's the hard part of this work on a social level. It's also the hard part on an individual level. We have to have a very robust system, processes that we can rely on and return to come down from our high horse, from our hyper intense states of whatever mania or insight, or our hyper low states of depression and meaninglessness, nihilism, blah, blah, blah. Both of those are the same kind of extreme delusion. It's believing something about reality based on this flood of sensations that you have not learned how to work with, right? So coming back to center is going to feel very boring to a hyper-addicted nervous system. And you don't want to feel bored because somehow feeling bored is like even worse than feeling the way you feel now. So you go to this yo-yo, the addiction yo-yo. And we live in a culture where both the idea of addiction and the idea of sobriety are colonized definitions. Which is to say, we think that addiction in this culture is addiction to substances only. That's the first colonization. The second colonization is we don't fucking know what sobriety is because we think sobriety is not being addicted to a substance. But what if I told you there's plenty of people addicted to emotions, behaviors, power dynamics? Are those substances? To the nervous system, they absolutely are. To the social narrative, those aren't substances. So how could you be addicted to them? So what is sobriety? Is, in my estimation, it is a wisdom path that is decolonial in nature. It decolonizes your perception on all levels. It makes you understand what perception is and isn't on multiple levels. in a multi-plural animistic way. And I lost a bit of that last thought there, but sobriety again. And it's the capacity to unionize. So I use that word, unionize. Not just be in union with, but unionize, like as in labor forces. To unionize with the wisdom forces of pain, fear, and hunger as allies, as wisdom forces, and ultimately death. Death as the yin substance, the darkness, the space that births everything into being, and where everything that has form returns to the formless. That's death. Death is not the absence of life. Death is the progenitor of life. And when you unionize with these forces over the course of your lifetime, you are preparing to transition from this form to the formless in a way that does not produce or produces less harm. It is a harm reductive method of resolving your fate or remediating your karma or whatever you want to call it. But that's the goal on some level, is to feel so whole and in unionized union with these forces that as you're living, you're making better and better choices, and all of those choices have hundreds of micro options all around. So you never feel boxed in to any kind of phenomenon, any kind of narrative, any kind of behavior. You're never forced into anything. Because even when bad things are happening, you realize you have options. Even if your option is to not go to a dark place in the heart where you start to hate yourself or others, right? And if you do feel that, you can play with it. You can say, oh, hatred, I see you. I've got a dozen strategies to relate with you better than I did a year ago. So that's a taste of what I'm talking about when I talk about what I do. I call it creative coaching, but it's really based in a very old wisdom tradition of becoming empty, negating the self. It's not a problem, but actually becoming part of nature again without all these separations. And so that gets into these ideas of transcendence and enlightenment, but I don't think it's any of that. It's just relating in a very peaceful way, where you can still have a lot of play in your peacefulness, but you're able to catch it when it goes off into intensityville and come back to something that is quite manageable and actually expand your capacity to manage over time. And it's not about perfection, but it does provide results. But those results are currently not classifiable in a colonial trauma healing frame. They're not. It doesn't work because this work is not designed to help you become a better capitalist or a better colonizer. It actually will make you understand that you don't want that shit on your conscience anymore when you die, because you actually feel the narcissistic addiction loop revving back up in your system. And you go, I'm not going to do that anymore. So hopefully this has given you some insights into how I practice. If you're interested in learning more, I have a Substack, which is my artistic sort of rants about this stuff. I also have plenty of videos on YouTube and on Instagram, and I also give private sessions to people, and I'm probably launching a kind of little drop-in Death Clown course where I do much more of the practice of how this relates to theater and performance, because I actually believe at my heart that theater is where all of the animistic rituals went to hide when they were starting to become colonized. And so that's sort of like the real love that I have in this world, is to make theater in a decolonial way, and it's very difficult. It's very difficult to make decolonial theater, decolonial comedy. It's very difficult right now because of what's popular, but that's sort of the soul work that I'm trying to accomplish in this lifetime. And I had to learn all this other stuff in order to be at the edge of this. So thank you all for listening. May this be of benefit to you and all your relations. And I'm open to any questions. You might not get the answer you like, but hopefully you can digest this and maybe practice and get some real experiences under your belt. And then your questions will be even better after you've practiced. All right. Thank you so much. Talk to you next time.